She laughed at his torn shoes and called him trash in front of the whole class. Years later, when she was trapped inside a burning car, the man who pulled her out was the same student she once humiliated. The story begins in a small town called Maplewood, where the school gates were chipped with rust, and the classrooms smelled of chalk and cold rain. The children came from all kinds of homes, some rich, most poor, but none carried a heavier burden than 12-year-old Daniel Ward. Daniel was quiet, polite, and painfully thin. His school uniform was too big, the shoes too small, and his lunchbox always empty. Yet behind his tired eyes was something bright, a mind sharp enough to solve any problem on the board. But in a world that noticed wealth more than worth, Daniel's brilliance was invisible. His teacher, Miss Claire Benson, was the kind of woman who smiled at the parents of rich children and frowned at the ones who brought in second-hand notebooks. She was young, beautiful, and cruel in a way that didn't seem obvious at first. Her words always came coated in sweetness before turning to poison. One morning, Daniel arrived late again. The rain had poured all night, flooding the narrow streets of the poor district. His mother, a cleaner, had lent him her only umbrella, which broke halfway through the walk. When he entered the classroom dripping wet, the other kids laughed. "Ah, look who decided to join us," Miss Benson said, tapping her polished shoes against the floor. "Mr. Ward, what happened this time? Your yacht broke down?" The class roared with laughter. Daniel's ears turned red. He kept his head down and walked to his seat. "Stop right there," Miss Benson snapped. "Did you even bring your homework?" He swallowed. "No, ma'am. I had to help my mum last night." "Oh, of course you did," she interrupted, eyes gleaming. "And I suppose you couldn't find time between your busy schedule of doing nothing?" Laughter again. Louder this time. Daniel clenched his fists but said nothing. "Everyone take note," Miss Benson said, walking past his desk. "This is what happens when you don't care about your future. If you don't study, you'll end up like Daniel, poor, pitiful, and hopeless." A paper ball hit his back. Someone whispered, "Beggar boy." Daniel bit the inside of his cheek until it bled. He wanted to shout, to tell them how hard his mother worked, how he stayed up late reading old textbooks by candlelight. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring at the board, the letters blurring through tears. That night, his mother found him sitting on the floor, his schoolbooks open, his eyes red. "Danny, what's wrong?" she asked gently. "Nothing, Mum," he murmured. But she saw the bruise on his arm where someone had shoved him, the tear in his sleeve. "You're lying," she whispered. "Did they laugh again?" He nodded slightly. She cupped his face. "You listen to me, Daniel Ward. You're not less than anyone. You hear me? One day you'll be someone they can't ignore." He smiled weakly. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," she said, kissing his forehead. From that night on, Daniel made himself a promise. He wouldn't let their words define him. He would study harder than anyone, work longer than anyone. He would rise. But life had a way of testing promises. At school, Miss Benson's cruelty deepened. She would call on him to read aloud just to mock his accent. She once made him stand outside in the rain because he forgot a pen. And when the end-of-term results were posted, she refused to believe he'd scored highest in science. "You cheated," she said coldly. "I didn't," he whispered. "I studied." "You? Study? Don't make me laugh. You can barely afford paper." He lowered his eyes, humiliated. She tore up his test paper in front of everyone. Years later, when Daniel looked back, that moment became the spark that changed everything. The humiliation didn't break him, it built him. He left Maplewood with nothing but a scholarship and a dream. His mother worked double shifts to pay for his travel. "Go make something of yourself," she said, hugging him tight at the bus stop. "I will, Mum," he promised. The years that followed weren't easy. Daniel faced rejection after rejection. He worked part-time jobs, washing dishes, stacking shelves, delivering food. But every night, no matter how tired he was, he studied. He studied medicine. He'd always wanted to understand how to heal what was broken, perhaps because he knew what it felt like to be broken himself. Time passed. The boy they called Beggar grew into a man with steady hands and tired eyes. He finished top of his class at university, specializing in emergency medicine. When he put on his doctor's coat for the first time, he remembered his mother's words, "You'll be someone they can't ignore." He smiled. Meanwhile, back in Maplewood, Miss Benson's life wasn't as golden as she had once imagined. Her beauty faded, her temper grew sharper, and her reputation began to crumble. Her career was no longer admired. Students feared her, parents complained, and soon she was transferred to another district. Loneliness crept in like a cold draft. The men she chased for money had long forgotten her. The world she looked down upon no longer looked up to her. But fate wasn't finished with her yet. One rainy night years after Daniel had left Maplewood, a car skidded on the highway near the town. It slammed into a tree, metal twisting, glass shattering. The driver was trapped inside, a woman barely conscious, blood running down her forehead. When paramedics arrived minutes later, one of them called the hospital for emergency backup. A doctor on duty nearby responded immediately. That doctor was Daniel Ward. Rain lashed against the windshield as Daniel's car sped through the night. His pager had gone off barely 5 minutes ago. Female patient, trapped in a vehicle, head trauma, possible internal bleeding. He didn't know who it was, but something about the location, just outside Maplewood, sent a strange chill through him. It had been years since he'd seen that name on a map. When he arrived, flashing lights painted the trees red and blue. Paramedics were working frantically beside a wrecked silver sedan crushed against a tree. Smoke curled from the bonnet, mixing with the smell of petrol and rain. "She's alive, barely," a paramedic shouted. Head laceration, broken ribs, pulse weak. Daniel threw on his gloves and ducked beside the wreck. The woman's face was half covered in blood, her eyes fluttering open and shut. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked, voice steady. A faint whisper. "Please, help me." Something about her voice tugged at him. He frowned, leaning closer, brushing away the strands of wet hair from her face. For a moment he froze. It was Miss Benson. The world seemed to tilt. The rain faded, the noise blurred. All he could see was her face, the same face that had once smirked at his tears, that had crushed his confidence in front of everyone. But now it looked human, fragile, broken. A paramedic shouted, "Doctor, we're losing her." Daniel blinked, snapping back into focus. "All right, let's move. Get the stretcher ready." He pushed aside every old emotion, anger, pain, pride, and focused only on saving her life. Within minutes they had her out of the wreck. Her pulse flickered weakly under his fingers. "Hang in there," he muttered, pressing gauze to her wound. "You're going to be all right." At the hospital, she was rushed into surgery. Hours passed. When the operation finally ended, the clock read 3:17 a.m. Daniel walked out, exhausted, sweat sticking to his neck. She was stable for now. He leaned against the wall outside the recovery ward and let out a long breath. Fate had an odd sense of humor. The next morning, when she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was him, standing beside her bed in a white coat. "Good morning, Miss Benson," he said quietly. She blinked, confused. "Do I know you?" "Yes," he said simply. "It's been a long time." She squinted at him, struggling to see through the haze of pain and medication. Then recognition dawned. Her lips parted. "Daniel Ward." He nodded. Her breath hitched. She stared at him, disbelief flooding her face. "You're a doctor?" "I am." Silence. Only the steady beep of the heart monitor filled the room. I don't understand," she whispered. How did you?" "Work. Study. Time," he said, shrugging lightly. "And a lot of things you probably wouldn't believe." Tears filled her eyes. "You saved my life?" He hesitated before nodding. "Yes. It's my job." Her gaze dropped to the blanket. "After what I did to you, you still helped me?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "If I hadn't, someone else would have. I didn't do it for you, Miss Benson. I did it because no one deserves to die alone in the rain." Her lips trembled. For once she had no words. The arrogance, the pride, all of it had been washed away somewhere along the years. He turned to leave, but she spoke again, voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." He paused at the door. "You don't have to say that." "I do," she insisted weakly. "I ruined so many lives, Daniel. You were just a boy. And I was cruel because I hated myself. I saw your kindness, your potential, and it made me angry. I wanted to break what I didn't have." Daniel said nothing. He just stood there watching her. "I never thought I'd see you again," she continued softly. "And if I did, I thought you'd hate me." He smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. "I used to. But hate doesn't heal anything. I learned that a long time ago." She looked away, tears streaming silently. "You're a better person than I ever was." He left the room quietly, closing the door behind him. Over the next few days, Daniel visited her regularly to check her progress. Every time she tried to apologize again, and every time he stopped her. "Rest," he'd say. "That's all you need to do." But one afternoon, as he checked her vitals, she said something that made him pause. "You know, Daniel, I lost everything," she said softly. "My job, my home, my friends. I thought money and power made me important. I didn't realize how small I was until no one came to visit me in hospital. He looked up from his clipboard. People can change. Do you think I can? She asked. He studied her face, lined with age, stripped of pride. If you mean it, yes. She nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time I try. When she was discharged a few weeks later, Daniel helped her sign the final forms. She hesitated before leaving. Daniel, she said softly, thank you for everything. I don't deserve it. He smiled. No one ever does. Take care of yourself, Miss Benson. She turned to go, but before she walked out the door, she asked, do you still live here? In Maplewood. He shook his head. I built a clinic on the outskirts. For families who can't afford proper care. Something flickered in her eyes, admiration, maybe regret. You became the man I should have helped you become, she murmured. Daniel watched her go, her limp slow but determined. The same woman who once humiliated him now walked away with tears instead of pride. That night, he sat in his small office, the city lights glimmering outside the window. His mother's picture sat on the desk beside his stethoscope. He smiled faintly at it. You were right, Mum, he whispered. They can't ignore me now. But even as he said it, there was no triumph in his voice, only quiet peace. Because in saving her, he'd also freed himself. Months passed and life slowly returned to its usual rhythm for Daniel. The hospital buzzed with new patients, new challenges, new faces. But every now and then, the memory of that stormy night, and Miss Benson lying helpless in the wreck, would creep into his thoughts. He never quite understood why fate had placed her back in his path, but perhaps it was life's way of testing the lessons he'd learned about compassion and forgiveness. One morning, as he finished his rounds, the receptionist handed him an envelope. Someone left this for you, Dr. Ward. Said it was urgent. He turned it over. No name, no return address, just his name scrawled in shaky handwriting. He opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter. Dear Daniel, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. I've spent these last months thinking about my life. The students I hurt, the dreams I crushed, the people I humiliated. I'm trying to make things right now in small ways. There's a community school nearby and they need volunteers. I started teaching there. It's not much, but it feels like I'm finally doing something that matters. I hope one day I can repay your kindness. Yours sincerely, Margaret Benson. He sat for a long moment, reading and rereading the note. There was something humble in the words, something he never thought he'd see from her. It made him smile faintly. Over the next few weeks he got busy again. Life in the clinic outside Maplewood had become more demanding than ever. Families traveled from nearby villages just to be treated. Mothers came with sick children, farmers with injuries, elders seeking comfort. And Daniel, always patient, treated them with the same compassion his mother once showed him. But one day, fate decided to stir their paths again. It was a bright Saturday morning when Daniel's small clinic hosted a free health camp for underprivileged children. Volunteers from the community came to help manage the crowd, distribute supplies, and keep the children entertained. As Daniel checked the child's temperature, he heard a familiar voice behind him, calmer now, softer. Dr. Ward? He turned around and there she was. Miss Benson, though she no longer looked like the woman he remembered. Her hair had turned silver, her posture slightly bent. She wore a simple cotton dress and carried a box of school supplies. Miss Benson, he greeted, smiling politely. You came. I told you I wanted to make things right, she said with a small smile. I brought books, crayons, and a few storybooks for the kids. Thought it might cheer them up while they wait. That's thoughtful, he replied. The children will love that. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the bustling clinic. You've built something beautiful here, Daniel. I can see how much people respect you. He gave a modest shrug. It's not about respect. It's about giving them what I never had, a place where they feel seen. Her eyes softened. And you've done exactly that. As the day went on, Daniel noticed something remarkable. Miss Benson was patient, gentle, even playful with the children. She read them stories, helped them color pictures, and laughed easily, a sound he'd never associated with her before. The kids adored her instantly. During lunch break, she sat with him under the shade of a mango tree outside the clinic. They ate sandwiches from paper bags. For a while, neither spoke. Then she said quietly, You know, when I first started teaching, I wanted to be someone who changed lives. But somewhere along the line, I became bitter. I envied the ones who were happier than me. I took my pain out on others, especially the ones I saw something special in. Like you. Daniel listened, his eyes distant. When I saw you today working here, I realized you became exactly what I once dreamed of becoming, she continued. Kind, respected, loved. He smiled faintly. Maybe it took both of us time to find who we were meant to be. She nodded slowly, her gaze softening. I wish I could go back and do things differently. You can't change the past, Daniel said gently. But you can change what comes after it. They sat quietly again, watching the children play nearby. A small boy ran up and tugged at Miss Benson's sleeve. Teacher, will you come read us another story? Her eyes lit up. Of course, sweetheart. She turned to Daniel and smiled. Duty calls. He watched her go, and for the first time he felt something unexpected. Not pity, not resentment, but admiration. The woman who had once torn him down was now rebuilding others. That evening, after the camp ended, she helped tidy up. As she packed the leftover supplies, she turned to him and said, Daniel, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. Before the accident, I wasn't just unhappy, I was alone. My husband left years ago, my family stopped speaking to me, and I filled the emptiness with cruelty. I thought hurting others made me powerful. Daniel looked at her, his voice calm. And now I see how wrong I was. Power isn't control, it's compassion. You showed me that. He nodded slowly. We all learn in our own time. Tears glistened in her eyes. I want to help you here at your clinic, if you'll let me. I can teach the children who come in. Read to them, help them with lessons while they wait. Daniel smiled warmly. You don't need my permission, Miss Benson. You're always welcome. From that day on, she became a regular face at the clinic. She helped with paperwork, comforted frightened children, and taught basic reading to the mothers who couldn't afford school. Everyone began calling her Auntie Margaret. And as the weeks turned into months, something incredible happened. She started to heal. One afternoon, she found Daniel sitting outside, fixing a broken chair. You work too hard, she teased. He chuckled. Occupational hazard. Then she grew quiet, watching the sun dip behind the hills. You know, Daniel, if someone had told me years ago that the boy I humiliated would one day become my savior, I'd have laughed at them. But life is full of irony, isn't it? He looked at her and smiled. Maybe that's how life balances things out. She laughed softly. Perhaps. But there's one thing I need to say before it's too late. He frowned slightly. What is it? She took a deep breath. Thank you for saving my life, not just that night, but in every way that followed. You didn't just treat my wounds. You gave me a reason to start over. Daniel didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, eyes warm. Sometimes that's all anyone needs, a second chance. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, they sat in silence. Two souls once divided by bitterness, now united by forgiveness. When the ambulance stopped outside the hospital, Olivia was still unconscious. Ethan jumped out first, shouting for help, his hands shaking as the paramedics rolled her out. He stayed beside her all the way, refusing to move, holding her cold hand tightly as they rushed her inside. For a moment, standing under those bright white hospital lights, he felt like that boy again, the one who had once stood outside the school gates, powerless, humiliated, and invisible. But this time he wasn't helpless. Hours passed. Doctors moved in and out. Ethan sat outside the emergency room, staring blankly at the floor. His heart pounded with guilt and confusion. Why did this happen to her? He had spent so many years hating Olivia. Her face, her voice, her cruel laughter when she mocked him in front of the class. But now, seeing her so fragile, pale, and broken, that hate seemed meaningless. She was no longer that arrogant teacher. She was just human. When the doctor came out at last, Ethan jumped up. She's stable, the doctor said. It was a cardiac arrest triggered by extreme stress. You did well bringing her in. Another few minutes and she wouldn't have made it. Ethan nodded, his chest tight. Relief hit him like a wave. He sat down again, covering his face with his hands. He didn't know if it was from exhaustion or emotion, but tears rolled down his cheeks. When he was finally allowed inside, Olivia was asleep. Her face looked peaceful, though weak. Her right hand had a small 4-tube. Ethan sat beside her quietly. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and faint flowers. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. He stayed until she woke. It was almost dawn when her eyes fluttered open, confused, scanning the room, then freezing when she saw him. Ethan? Her voice cracked, soft, barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? You fainted, he said quietly. Heart attack. I was there. Her eyes widened slightly. You saved me? Ethan nodded slowly. I guess so. For a long time she didn't speak. Her gaze turned distant, lost somewhere in her memories. Then softly she said, "You should have left me there." He frowned. "Don't say that." She turned away. "No, you don't understand. You don't know what I did to you, what I took from you." "I know enough," he said. "You were cruel. But I've made peace with it." Her lips trembled. "Peace? After everything I did to you? I destroyed your confidence. I made you feel worthless. You had so much potential, Ethan. You were bright. Smarter than half the teachers in that building. And her voice broke. I tore you down because I was jealous." He blinked, stunned. "Jealous?" Olivia nodded weakly. "Yes. I was young then. Newly graduated, insecure, desperate to prove I was in control. And then there was you, this quiet, brilliant boy who wrote essays that made me question my own worth. I saw in you what I could never be. And instead of nurturing that, I tried to crush it. I thought humiliating you would make me feel superior. But it only made me feel small." Ethan stared at her, speechless. He hadn't expected honesty. He hadn't expected tears in her eyes. "I've lived with that guilt for years," she said. "Every student I taught after you, I tried to make up for it. But I could never forget your face that day. The way you looked at me when I mocked your second-hand shoes. That shame stayed with me." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "People change," he said quietly. "You were young and foolish. We all make mistakes." She gave a bitter smile. "You're kinder than I deserve." Silence filled the room again. Ethan looked down at his hands. "You know what's strange?" he said finally. "I used to dream about this moment, you apologizing, me walking away without saying a word. But now that it's here, I don't feel anger. Just sadness." Olivia's eyes glistened. "You have every right to hate me." He shook his head. "No. Hate is heavy. I carried it long enough. It doesn't fix anything." She wiped her eyes, voice trembling. "Then maybe saving me was your revenge." Ethan looked up, a faint smile touching his lips. Maybe it was forgiveness. He stood up, gently placing her chart on the side table. "You should rest. You're going to be okay." As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Ethan," she said softly, "thank you. Not just for saving me, but for reminding me that goodness still exists. Even in the people we hurt." He nodded once and walked out. A week later, Olivia was discharged. She found out through hospital staff that Ethan had paid part of her medical bill anonymously. She tried to return it, but he refused to meet her again. So she wrote him a letter, pages of apology, gratitude, and reflection. She left it at the community center, knowing he'd find it eventually. In the letter, she confessed everything she never could say aloud. How teaching had once been her passion but her pride destroyed it, how seeing him alive, successful, and kind broke her in the best way possible. Ethan did find the letter days later. He read it quietly in his office, staring at her handwriting trembling across the paper. At the end, one line stood out. "You were the lesson I never deserved to teach." He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his desk drawer, beside a faded photograph of his old classroom, the one that had shaped his pain and, eventually, his purpose. Years passed. Olivia never returned to teaching, but she volunteered at shelters and helped struggling students find confidence again. Ethan continued running his charity, giving scholarships to underprivileged kids. Their paths never crossed again, but the bond of that night, the night he chose compassion over vengeance, remained like an unspoken truth between them. Sometimes, late at night, Ethan would sit by the window, remembering her words, the trembling apology, the regret in her eyes. And though part of him still ached for the boy he used to be, he also understood that forgiveness wasn't about freeing her. It was about freeing himself. Because the real victory wasn't saving her life. It was saving his own soul.